I want to break into a new section now for the class. We've talked about the greenhouse construction, talked about glazing materials, heating, cooling, controls. Next several weeks of the class, we're going to talk about potting soils, potting media that's used in greenhouse production. We'll talk about water irrigation, and we'll talk about greenhouse gases, and finish up the class with pest control strategies and such as that. So, how many of you have taken Dr. Barbarick's soils class? Okay, about half of you. Okay. One of these days, I'm going to get Dr. Barbarick to talk about potting soils. He seems to think that the only soils out there is dirt. And I challenge any of you to tell him I said that, because I usually have coffee with him every morning. You're not going to tell him? That Newman says the only thing that he teaches, the only kind of soils he teaches is dirt.
I don't say the D word around that.
Huh? Okay. Those of you that know Dr. Barbarick know what I'm talking about. Those of you that don't, just go take his class. You should take his class. Okay. One of the most important things to remember about the rhizosphere, and one of the things I like to talk about is rhizosphere, or root substrate. You'll also hear the terms potting soil, but to me, potting soil is kind of a double word. I like to use the word potting media or medium, which is the singular. Root zone substrate is probably more appropriate term to use. And the reason why I don't use the word soil is because to me, soil is what's the native earth, or which you grow crops in, or something like that. So I like to use the word substrate, medium, media, potting soil is what most people use. Artificial media, you'll hear that term. I don't really care what you use, as long as you understand the differences between them. There are four characteristics or four functions of the rooting substrate or the substrate that must be satisfied for plants to grow. First and foremost, serves as a reservoir for nutrients, a reservoir for water, provide gas exchange, and provide anchorage or support. It's got to supply those four things for plants to grow. Talking about the different components and constituents that you could use, you might think sand. Sand has pretty good support. It's going to provide a good structural body to hold the plant. It's going to give you good air exchange because it's got lots of pore space, right? But it doesn't hold water well, and it doesn't have any nutrient holding capacity, or what we call cation exchange capacity. Clay, on the other hand, which is the very finer component of soil. What are the three components of soil? Sand, silt, and clay. Okay? We're not going to talk about silt. Clay has a high nutrient and water holding capacity because it has a high cation exchange capacity, but since it's so fine textured and the pore space is so small, it has very poor gas exchange. One of our goals in a pot, in a greenhouse, is to provide good water holding capacity, good nutrient holding capacity, airspace, and structural support. Water, we can grow plants in water. It provides water and nutrients. It'll supply the rhizosphere with water and nutrients. We can even introduce oxygen into it for gas exchange, but it's not going to give us any support. So in other words, for water to work as a rhizosphere, we have to provide some kind of a physical support. Question?
If you have a very clay soil, what can you do to increase the aeration?
If you have a very heavy clay soil, to increase the aeration, what most people do is blend in organic matter. Organic matter. In a heavy clay soil, if you blend, for instance, some people say, well, I'm just going to put sand in there because it's the opposite of clay. All you're going to do is turn it into a brick. Now you're making bricks. So to make a heavy clay soil breathe, to give it good aeration, it requires organic matter. Some people think of field soil, and I get phone calls from gardeners and such, and I say, I can't get my houseplants to grow. And I said, what kind of potting soil did you use? And they said, well, I just went and got good garden soil. I have great garden soil. Great garden soil is terrible. When you put it in a pot, because all you're doing is you're transferring that beautiful garden soil into a small confined container, and it turns into a brick. Remember, in the garden, it has a whole earth to serve as its buffer. In a pot, you have no buffer. It's this confined environment. So remember, we're working with a confined environment. So field soil is going to give us good support. It's going to give us good high nutrient capacity, water capacity, but very poor gas exchange because it's going to act like clay.
So you're specifically talking about field soil?
Field soil, garden soil, the soil that you're going to pull out of your yard.
But not like the soil you pull out of your yard in Washington or New York.
Not out of the soil. I'm pretty much generically saying soil out of any garden soil from any part of the country. It's going to be that way. Colorado is going to be a little worse than others because they're going to have a higher clay content. Southeastern United States, we have lots of clay soils, higher clay content. If you're working with a high sandy soil, it may not be quite as bad. But typically speaking, soil, field soil, topsoil, garden soil is not going to be an ideal thing for potting soil. And ideally, for that to work, we're going to use organic matter. And most of our potting soils that we use, most of our greenhouse soils, what we use organic matter as our base. And it's important that we think about the stability of that organic matter amongst everything else. Organic matter, the size of the organic matter is going to be roughly related to the amount of decomposition it's gone through. The finer the texture, the higher the decomposition. Of course, the smaller the texture, the smaller the pores, the less air and gas exchange. Another thing about stability of organic matter is as it decomposes in our potting soil, if we were to use it in potting soil, it's going to shrink in volume. So we want to use highly decomposed material because we don't want our potting soil to change significantly the duration of a crop. You need to think about how long that crop is going to be in the pot, though, for instance. If you're using interior foliage plants where that plant could potentially be in that pot for 2, 3, 4 years, we want something that's absolutely stable. But if we're growing a bedding plant crop where we're happy to get that stuff off the bench in 2 to 4 weeks, and it's going to go in somebody's landscape, we're not going to be worried so much about that substrate shrinkage. So straw and sawdust, they have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, which I'll get to in a moment, typically have poor stability because they shrink and they decompose over time. I have a compost bin in my backyard. Right now, my compost bin is about 3 feet deep. One of the chores I have to do this weekend is turn that compost bin. And when I turn that compost bin, it's going to go from 3 feet to probably 18 inches just because the decomposition is happening underneath some of the other debris. And as I loosen it up and get some of the materials that's not decomposed out for recomposting in another bin, it'll shrink in volume. So it shrinks in volume quite a bit. And it's all based upon what we call the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And when you do a soil test, one of the soil tests that they send you back for your garden soil, your topsoil, you're going to get a CN ratio. The CN ratios that we're looking at in garden and field soils are really not relevant for what we're doing. For organic matter, ideally you want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 to 1. And 30 to 1 contains enough, has been decomposed enough that it's not going to rob our plants of nitrogen. Anything greater than 30 to 1, the microorganisms are going to move into the rhizosphere and they're going to start chewing and eating on that raw carbon and try to decompose it. And one of the nutrients that they require to do that conversion is nitrogen. And they'll consume that nitrogen and rob the plant. So if you see somebody growing in a high C/N ratio plant like raw sawdust, you'll hear people say, well, that material is poisonous to the plant. It's not poisonous to the plant. It's robbing the plant of nutrients. So it looks yellow and looks sickly. So we try to use organic material that's got a carbon to nitrogen ratio of less than 30 to 1. Sawdust, for instance, is 1,000 to 1. And that's one of the reasons why we don't use sawdust. We do use a product, we use composted pine bark, and pine bark usually has a C/N ratio of about 300 to 1. Why do you believe that pine bark as a potting soil would work at 300 to 1, whereas a product like sawdust would never work, even though it's 1,000 to 1? What's the difference between pine bark and sawdust? Can you think about it? Have you ever worked with pine bark? Some of your internships, you use pine bark mulch maybe?
A little more acidic.
Is it more acidic? Oh, slightly, but not significantly. Think of some anatomical differences. What's the difference? Where does the pine bark come from? Where does sawdust come from on a tree?
Xylem versus epidermis.
Okay, the sawdust is what part of the tree?
Secondary xylem.
Secondary xylem. That's correct. Exactly correct. The sawdust is the secondary xylem, and the pine bark is the. Think to your plant physiology in BZ 120. The cork phylogen, or the outside. So pine bark is actually heavily lignified, whereas sawdust is straight, ugly, very unlignified tissue, mostly raw carbohydrates. So the lignified tissue is going to be difficult for the microorganisms to break down over time. So that's one of the reasons why pine bark is such a good potting soil. And in fact, most of the southeastern United States, almost all the plant material, all the nursery plants, all the greenhouse plants are grown in southern pine bark because they have a heavy forestry industry. So we want less than 30 to 1. That's desirable. Anything more than that requires free nitrogen. When you're looking at your potting mixes, you also need to think about bulk density. And they talk about in the textbook dry bulk density and wet bulk density. The dry bulk density refers to the oven dry weight of the media divided by the volume. It's in pounds per cubic foot. And this is, we look at bulk density primarily, the dry bulk density, looking at it primarily for shipping. High bulk density is going to require more shipping and freight cost. Low bulk density is going to require less freight cost because it doesn't weigh as much. You also need to think about your labor. How much can your labor pick up and move? If the bulk density is too low, if it's very light mix, of course, it's going to have poor water holding capacity. It's going to dry out quickly. And also, plants are going to fall over. One of the things I don't want to happen is for my crew to go through and water plants and have to be standing up plants at the same time. In addition, if you're growing crops that are top heavy, like foliage plants and interior scape, we want to have a heavier bulk density. Interior plants, quite often, they'll blend in sand to increase that bulk density. If it's too high, of course, it's going to cost more to ship, and it's going to be harder to pick up. And the wet bulk density refers to what does that pot weigh at container capacity. Container capacity is the concept where this is similar to water holding capacity that you covered in soils classes, but it's the water content of the media after complete saturation and all the gravitational water has fallen out of the pot. And we'll do this in lab where we'll calculate the container capacity with the volume to saturate versus what comes out and report it as a percent of the total volume. Again, if it's too light, it's topple hard. If it's too heavy, you have extra shipping expenses. We really want it to be around 40 to 60 pounds per cubic foot. So we want it to give us good structural support. We want to give air exchange. We want to give water exchange, it must hold enough water, must hold enough air. And in the pot, we've got solid particles and pore space, and that pore space is both filled with air, water, and unavailable water. Unavailable water is that water that a plant can't pull. We call that wilting point, 15 bars. So most of our greenhouse potting soils are between 80 and 90% pore space. Mineral soil, this is again what I'm calling topsoil, field soil, the stuff in the outside. It's usually going to have about 50% solid space and 50% pore space. A potting soil that's got 1 part sand, 1 part sphagnum peat moss, and 1 part soil, and this in fact, when I was in school, was what most people grew their crops in. You can see that our airspace is starting to increase up to about over 50%. And so it's about 60-40. Adding composted pine bark, you can see that our airspace is going up even higher. 3 parts bark, 1 part peat, 1 part sand. That's a standard nursery mix. Standard greenhouse mixes are about half peat and half vermiculite or something else, or half peat and half rock wool. And you can see that this is where our best pore space falls for growing plants in the greenhouse. Again, remember, we're growing in a confined pot, a confined space, so we need to make sure we have enough air. When I talk to greenhouse growers, talking about the root system, and we often call it the hidden half of your plant, to think about selling roots, not selling shoots. If you sell good roots, you're going to sell good plants. And pore space grows good roots. Unavailable water, that's water that's held by solid materials, unavailable to root. To the root systems are not able to pull it off the soil material. Typically speaking, we don't see these kind of water tensions in the greenhouse. You hear about this with desert plants such as that. Unless we're talking about core or coconut fiber. Coconut fiber has water that's more unavailable water than other potting substrates. So available water is that water that's available to the plant. The substrate components that you're using in your potting soil is not so much what it is, but how it's been milled and what its chemical characteristics are. I've done enough research over the years that I have grown and done research on growing plants in ground up automobile tires. I've used composted garbage. I've used sphagnum peat moss. I've used processed poultry manure. I've used even ground up butter tubs. And I've been able to grow plants in just about anything that I've ever worked with. It's easy. You need to think about milling, composting, particle size, but the biggest thing that you need to think about when growing plants, the most important part inside that pot is how much space, how much air, how much pore space there is. In addition, the container height is going to change how much water holding capacity your potting soil has. Remember, it's a confined space. We're not talking outside. So, I got a little sponge demonstration I'm going to show you. So, typically speaking, we think of a container having capillary action, capillary force, holds our plant. I need a new sponge one of these days. This one's getting kind of wore out. So the sponge is 2 inches by 4 1/4 by 8 1/2 inches. It's got a total volume, the whole sponge itself before it started to rot away, is about almost 1,200 milliliters. And the pore space, in other words, is 950 mils. It's got 80% total porosity. That's the total pore space. In other words, if I was able to completely saturate this sponge and all the pore space was full of water, about 80% or 950 mils is that pore space. And the water that drips out is the water that's not held by capillary force, and the water that remains is the container capacity of this particular sponge. Now when I change the height of my container, so right now consider this a bedding plant flat, if I change it to a container, my water holding capacity changed. I'm not squeezing it, I promise. So it holds, but just by changing the height of the container, I've changed the available water. So now I'm going to go from a pot, a regular 6-inch by 6-inch standard pot, I'm going to go to a tree tube, and it changes again. So the taller the container, the finer the texture of your mix needs to be to maintain good capillary action up the top of the container. Shorter containers, we use a coarser texture with more pore space. Does that make sense? There are people that pay hundreds of dollars to go to clinics and workshops on potting soil to see that demonstration. Of course, you paid that much too, so. You know, nothing that I do in this class is different than any other greenhouse management class in the country. We all teach the same thing. So, thinking about a 6-inch pot, we haven't changed our potting soil. For instance, we have 13% solid material, and the pore space is, I'll do my math here in a minute, 87% is our pore space. 6-inch container, 20% air, 67% water. But notice how as the pot size goes down, our airspace goes down. And for instance, that's a 4-inch pot. 48 is referring to, number 48 is referring to 48 units per 1020 tray. The 1020 tray is basically 11 inches by 21 inches. It's not an 1121, it's a 1020. That's why, a 2x4 doesn't measure 2x4 inches either. 288 is 288 cells per tray. And a 648, those are little bitty plugs. But you can see how by just changing the cell size, how my percent water and my airspace goes way down. So you need to find a fine point and adjust your potting mix. So your seedling mixes and your cell trays, you need to use a finer, as coarse a texture as you can, but still have potting soil in the volume. Another thing about potting soil is how it's handled in the greenhouse. You don't want to pack your potting soil. You want to put it in the potting soil, and one of the challenges is using mechanical filling devices is to make sure that they all have the same density. They're not compacted at different rates. Because if they're compacted at different rates, you're going to have different airspace volumes. We have different airspace volumes. Your grower has to compensate with the water hose. And so we want to have our compaction to be uniform. Typically, we want to make it not so compacted. A lot of flat filling machines will have a brush on it to get the compaction at a specific level. And again, we want to have everything changes with the size of the pot. This is all the same content. So we need to have airspace. We need to have water holding capacity. Now we have to have nutrient holding capacity. And the nutrient holding capacity is referred to as what we call a cation exchange capacity. Now you covered cation exchange capacity in soils, but what basically what cation exchange capacity refers to is the number of negative charges in your potting soil that's able to hold on to a cation. Okay, plain and simple. Now, on a typical soil analysis for field soil, garden soil, topsoil, they're going to give you the cation exchange analysis in 100 in milliequivalents per gram. In potting soil, we want milliequivalents per 100 for volume. And we're typically wanting to get around 6 to 15 milliequivalents per 100 cc's. And products like clay, any kind of clay compound we can put in our potting soil, peat moss, coconut core, pine bark, these all have a fairly high cation exchange capacity and will give us some nutrient holding power. So just an example, the dark gray areas in this drawing are soil particles, and they get little negative charges, and they hold on to calcium, potassium, magnesium, and holds everything together. The pH, a lot of people put a lot of thought into their pH. I'm more interested in the starting pH, and that's just about it. I'm more worried about the cation exchange capacity. pH is the negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration in the potting soil. You've all had this in chemistry class. You've all had this in soils, and this is as much as I'm going to cover. But I want you to know that potting soils that have topsoil blended into them, say about 10%, we typically use a pH. We shoot for a pH range of about 6.2 to 6.8. Soil less, which is 100% organic matter or no potting soil at all, we want the pH a little lower, 5.4 to 6. These are target values. If you're growing a crop that is an acidic crop, like azaleas or rhododendrons, we want a lower pH. If it's an alkaline crop, like a geranium, we're going to go with a higher pH. So you adjust these, the pH of your potting soil with things like limestone. Most organic materials that we apply into our potting soil usually have a pH around 4 to 5. So we're going to add limestone to bring the pH up. Using alkaline products is very difficult to take the pH down, however. And it's always better to adjust your pH before you plant, because it's very difficult to raise the pH if you forgot to put the limestone into your potting mix. There are ways to do it, but it's not so easy. It's always better to do it in the blending process or the pre-plant. The components of your soil, like I told you earlier, I have grown just about everything that you can imagine. You need to know the properties of what your final goal is, and you can blend the components in to meet your final goal. So that means you need to know what your formulations are and know the functions. Okay. So what are the 4 components, again, of a root substrate? It's got to provide water, it's got to provide air, it's got to provide nutrients, it's got to provide support. Some other characteristics of a good media: water, nutrients, air, support, those are required. Other characteristics, these are the ideal situation, is we don't want it to change its characteristics during its cultivation period. In other words, we don't want it shrinking, we don't want it expanding, we don't want it losing its cation exchange capacity, we don't want the pH to change rapidly. We want everything to be stable during that crop. Good water holding capacity, good porosity, not too heavy. Should not have any hazardous substances. Now I'm typically thinking hazardous to plant life, not necessarily human life, but then again that's important too. For instance, when I worked with shredded tires, the deconstruction process of an automobile tire is fairly sophisticated. What are the components of a tire? Well, first you got the vulcanized rubber, which is what we're using to grow the plant in. But there's also rayon belting fabric, which is a waste product which is blown away during the deconstruction process. But there's also steel belting, which is a fine wire mesh inside the tire. If you don't take that out, you got little steel splinters that get in your fingernails when you're trying to plant. So that would be hazardous to people. But again, it's easy to get rid of. But we're talking primarily hazardous materials like herbicides, too much salt, mushroom spawn, for instance. Composted mushroom spawn. Some people have tried to grow in that. You can buy it in the garden centers. It has a lot of salt. If you were to get composted municipal waste, composted landscape waste from the city or from a golf course, it's highly likely it's going to be loaded full of herbicides. I want to know exactly where my potting soil is coming from. You know, I don't have any problem putting grass clippings in my own compost bin because I know exactly how much herbicide I use. And it must be free of pathogens, pests, seeds, and other plant propagules. One of the biggest pains to do is to grow a crop that's full of somebody else's waste plants. We don't want to have to deal with grass coming up in our pot of pansies. We want to make sure it's free of insects, pests. That's how Japanese beetle got into Colorado, was through contaminated soil. So some of the common things that we use in greenhouses, field soil, of course, we keep it in the list. Sphagnum peat moss, bark, sawdust, manure. Sawdust has been composted. Manures, vermiculite, calcined clay, bark at a greater grind size, sand, perlite. You can see which one of these characteristics have good water retention, good nutrient retention, aeration, and light and weight. And in potting soils, we typically like to take 3 or 4 different products, blend them together to get our ideal potting soil. And people ask me all the time, what is the ideal potting soil? And I can't give them an answer because I tell them it's dependent on your crop, your watering practices, your container size, and your end goal. So there is no ideal potting soil. And the people at Fisons and Miracle Grow and will argue with me all day long, but there is no ideal potting soil. So going back to cut flower production, early greenhouses where we grew everything in ground beds, the first potting soil was field soil. And what they would do in ground beds is they would typically grow their potting soil or grow their field soil in the field with a green manure crop like alfalfa or sorghum or something like that to make the soil healthy. And then they would harvest that, bring it into the greenhouse and put it in their ground beds, and they would rotate it. So the best soils for ground beds is a structured loamy soil. A lot of, like I said, green manure crops it may take 2 or 3 years to grow a good potting soil, a good soil to bring into your ground beds. Some of the green manures are things like bluegrass, Sudan grass, clovers. I think if you've ever dug up sod, you can see how friable and wonderful that soil is right in that 4 to 6 inches beneath your sod layer. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. But when we bring it into the greenhouse, we're going to have to pasteurize it. We're going to have to clean it up. We're going to have to sterilize the soil to make sure we don't have any extra weeds or anything like that. So in long-term crops, like roses, it could be in the ground bed 6 to 7 years. we need to make sure that our conditioning is done well. Short-term crops, not such a big thing. We need to think about pasteurization, drainage. I showed you earlier bed design. And we need to focus on good pH, good cation exchange, and keep our soluble salt levels down. So, some people are still using a small percentage of topsoil in their container mixes for bedding plants and such as that. Welby Gardens is a good example. They're one of the few growers that are still putting native field soil into their pots. And one of the reasons they're doing that is to give them a good buffering capacity. It's their business philosophy that it makes a hardier plant, hence the name Hardy Boy. But it buffers their nutrient problems. It gives them added cation exchange capacity. If you're going to use potting soil, field soil in your potting soil, you need to make sure that it's good loam or silt loam soil. However, the quality, consistency, and uniformity over the topsoil that you're getting, because you're having to buy it on the open market probably, or growing or raising it yourself in maybe fields, hay fields or something like that, it's getting harder and harder to find. You know, one of my biggest challenges whenever I have purchased topsoil from a supplier is, am I getting topsoil or am I getting excavation from somebody's basement? So most people in our industry use peat moss. And peat moss is somewhat controversial. And we'll talk about some of that as we go on. But when we talk about peat, the U.S. Bureau of Mines, because this is a mined product, we have moss peat, reed sedge peat, and peat humus. And these are based upon the parent material or the plant material that the peat is derived from. The Federal Trade Commission, if a product is being sold as peat, it has to be 75% peat. Most of them are 95 to 99%. When you're talking about the sphagnum peats, reed sedge peat typically is 85 to 95% pure organic matter. They're different, when I talk about the different mosses, sphagnum peat moss comes from the sphagnum plant material, or sphagnum moss. It's a sphagnum plant in a bog, has the least amount of degradation, and it holds about 20 to 30 times its weight in water, pH of 3 to 4, 7 to 13 milliequivalents. And we're going to have to put in, if we're using straight peat moss, to get the pH up to 6.5, it's going to take about 14 to 35 pounds per cubic yard in our blending of limestone. We're not going to put in that much limestone because we're also going to blend in something like vermiculite or perlite or something else. So typically speaking, in a blended soil, you're only usually 10 to 12 pounds per cubic yard. Hypnum moss, or the Hypnum species, 5 to 7 times its capacity. Of course, the pH is higher and uses less limestone. Reed sedge, which is a blend of carices and phragmites, it's going to be variable in the degree of degradation depending on the bog that it comes from. And peat humus is the most highly degraded, the highest quality peat that you can find. So where does peat moss come from? Well, most of the peat moss comes from Canada in North America. Harvester is going to clear the bog of vegetation, and they're going to allow the peat moss to dry, and they're going to use a harvester. And the harvester is basically a very large vacuum cleaner, and then they screen and grade it, and they bale it for storage and shipment. Here's a picture of a peat bog that's owned by the Phosphorate Company in New Brunswick, Canada. You can see the harvested bogs, and you can see it's closely related to a body of water. The limitation to the harvesting of a bog is primarily access, because most of the bogs in the world are not accessible by anything except maybe a seaplane. Peatlands are found in all parts of the world, mostly in the northern hemisphere. About 4.5% of the total land mass of the world is peat bog. 80% of the peatlands in the United States are in Alaska. Most of those are inaccessible for harvesting. Most of the peat that's harvested in the United States comes from Michigan and Florida, and most of that is reed sedge peat, or reed sedge peats. They come out of bogs around ponds and such as that. The reed sedge bogs that I've seen in Florida, basically what they do is they go in and scoop out a bog, harvest the reed sedge peat, sell that off, fill the bog back up with water, and put gazillion-dollar homes around it and call it a lake. Only about 5% of the peat that's harvested in the United States is sphagnum peat. The Canadian government, Canada, they ship over 80% of their peat moss into the United States. 99% of all the peat that's sold in the sphagnum peat that's sold in the United States comes out of Canada. A small percentage is now starting to come out of Germany. Global peat moss production kind of peaked in 1989, and it declined with the Russian Revolution when the Soviet Union broke up. So the global peat, because most of the peat bogs in the world are actually in Russia. So 1992 was about 138.5 million tons of peat. So Canadian sphagnum peat moss is about 25% of the world's supply. 12% of Canada is peatland, but they're only harvesting about 40,000 acres. Why are they only harvesting about 40,000 acres? Because that's all the acreage they have access to with a truck or a train. Question?
I heard there's been a preference for peat growers would rather use Russian peat because they harvest it differently than Canadian peat.
Do they harvest it? Do the Russian? Okay, the people are starting to use Russian peat because they harvest it differently. I don't know that for a fact. I just know that the Russian peat is cheaper because it's not as heavily regulated. Canadian peat is heavily regulated.
So there's more demand for peat than Canada can put out.
There is a heavy demand on a worldwide basis for peat moss than Canada can put out. That is true. So I know that a lot of our growers in Colorado are using German and Russian peat because they're getting it for cheaper. Has to do with the exchange rate, has to do with all kinds of, it just baffles my mind how much peat moss is being shipped around the world. So they harvest a bog in Canada, and that's where I have most of my experience, for about 15 to 50 years, depending how deep it is. After you've harvested a bog, it can grow 1 foot of sphagnum moss in about 10 to 15 years after it's been harvested. So it is a somewhat renewable resource, and it's managed by the Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association. So what they have to do in Canada, the regulations require that before they harvest the peat bog, they have to look at the environment, record the flora and fauna, work with environmental groups, and they have to have a percentage of the bogs in that area for reserves. During the harvest, they need to limit the acreage they harvest, have a buffer zone. When they're done, they have to leave a layer of peat moss. Okay? And what they typically do is as they retire one peat bog, they'll take the next peat bog that they're going to harvest, they'll take the top 4 to 6 inches and resow the old peat bog with fresh plant material to get things kick-started. So it's a reclamation process. And sphagnum peat moss is primarily from the Sphagnum genus. It's got a pH of 3 to 4. Going to take limestone. We typically use dolomitic limestone, which is also has calcium and magnesium carbonate. We have a lime quarry just about on the way to Livermore, and most of what they're harvesting is calcium carbonate. Question?
What about in terms of like soil compaction with all the driving and trucks and all that kind of thing? Is that taken into account in that 10 to 15 years of regeneration?
Okay, soil compaction. Peat bogs doesn't take into account the construction and the compaction.
All the other stuff that goes around.
Peat bogs that they're typically harvesting could be anywhere from 30 to 40 feet deep of organic matter. And they're probably only going to harvest about 6 to 8 or 12 feet of that organic matter. Over time, it's going to be somewhat compacted, but they're using equipment with very wide tires, primarily because otherwise they'll get bogged down and sink into the materials. Some of the finest farmland there is farming on peat bogs. Like when you get those big, beautiful carrots out of Florida, those came from Sphagnum peat, reed sedge peat bogs that have been drained. Peat farming on peat is actually some of the finest quality vegetables you're going to find. Compaction is an issue over time, but it's more of an issue for keeping the equipment on top than. And I'll show. I have a video for this here in a minute. Here's a picture of a raw or a virgin bog. Here's a picture of the sphagnum moss. Here's a picture of the equipment driving over a sphagnum moss bog. One of the things that sets the prices of peat is the ability to get into the bog. If we have a cold, wet winter, it delays access to the bog. And if you have an early, cold fall, it cuts short your access to the bog. So oftentimes, the price of peat is based upon how much time they have in the bog and how much they can harvest. Because they don't harvest frozen bogs. And here's the machine. See the device that's going to till it up. It's basically a vacuum cleaner. And you see the wheels that it requires to keep it afloat.
The true nature of peat. Peat moss production in Canada. The first step in peat moss production is draining the land. A drainage ditch is dug around the harvesting zone to draw off the water. Surface vegetation is removed with a rotary cultivator to access the peat deposit. The plant fragments can then be used to restore a peat bog that has already been harvested. Shallow ditches are dug in parallel lines to reduce moisture. They drain into the ditch around the perimeter. A leveling auger is used to smooth out the terrain and give the furrows a rounded surface so that rainwater runs into the ditches. A harrow is used to make breaks in the capillary flow on the peatland crust to facilitate drying of the peat on the surface. 1 to 3 days later, the layer of dry peat is removed by vacuum harvesters or other harvesting equipment. The harvested material is transported in bulk form by trucks or trailers to a processing facility. Once the peat arrives at the factory, it goes through a preparation process throughout which samples are taken. The samples are used to verify product quality in laboratory. In many instances, the peat is mixed with other ingredients, such as agricultural lime, wetting agent, mineral fertilizers, and various forms of compost, as per client specifications. The peat products are packed in various formats. They will be shipped to professional growers in compressed bales or to retailers in smaller bags for amateur gardeners. let's look at the peat samples taken in the course of the preparation process. A whole range of tests are done to ensure quality control. Standard monitoring involves the completion of a range of laboratory analyses, including pH level, electrical conductivity, moisture content and wettability tests, and several tests with respect to the chemical makeup of the peat. Moreover, greenhouse experiments are undertaken with the growing medium with a view to offering clients innovative products entirely adapted to their needs. Peat moss harvested in Canada makes it possible to produce the equivalent of 15 billion plants in 750 milliliter pots. All that peat is just the thing to make the flowers in your garden bloom and produce the vegetables and herbs for your next meal.
All right, so the word peat is pretty generic. We just talked about sphagnum peat moss, and the next peat moss we'll talk about is Hypnum, and it's from species in the Hypnaceae family. To be a Hypnum peat, it's about 33% fiber, and more than half of it has to be from the Hypnaceae family. It's got a pH of 5.2 to 5.5. It's a little higher than sphagnum peat moss. It's more common in Europe and Russia or in the British Isles. Then the final one is reed sedge peat. Question?
Is the Hypnum moss what they were finding all the mummies and like mummified corpses in Ireland?
Is Hypnum peat moss where they're finding the mummified corpses in such an Ireland? I don't know. I don't know. I remember reading that story, but I don't remember the species and don't remember that they even specified it. So the best answer in this situation is I don't know. So, but it probably is. And you know, when I think of Hypnum peat, I always think of the Barrows section of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you remember in the first book. That's the first thought that when I think of Hypnum peat. I don't know why that image comes to my mind. So, but yes, I'm a Tolkien nerd. So, I was reading Tolkien when I was younger than you. That's how long it's been around. Okay. Now that I've sidetracked, reed sedge peat. Reed sedge peat is probably the most common in the continental United States, alongside bogs and such. It's from reed species, Phragmites, Scirpus typa. It's the decaying stalks and rhizomes and material from reeds and sedges. 50% reed sedge or other non-moss fibers. It's extremely variable depending on where you're getting your peats. The Florida peats are very different than the Michigan peats, which are very different than the Colorado peats. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Colorado mountain peat. However, I'm going to let the video speak for itself.
From high in the Rocky Mountains to a flower garden in the city below, from the earth of a high country meadow to a garden down on the plains, it is the soil that begins the process of life for all things that grow. America's most popular hobby, gardening, starts with the soil. And whether that soil be sand or clay, gardeners know that adding organic matter increases aeration, improves drainage, and allows water to be more easily absorbed by plant roots. The Colorado Federation of Garden Clubs wants you to know that a major source of that organic matter in the West is mountain peat, and that supplying it involves the destruction and elimination of unique wetlands called fens. Fens in the Rocky Mountains are located throughout the peaks, valleys and high elevation parks where snowmelt and rain feed springs coursing through remains of the last glaciers.
In the high country of the southern Rocky Mountains, there are generally two kinds of wetlands. Riparian wetlands occur along stream systems and are fed by the water moving down the stream. Away from streams, we have a lot of wetlands which are fed by groundwater, where the groundwater is close to the surface or actually is discharging to the surface all year long for hundreds or thousands of years. The roots and leaves and stems of plants that live in that wetland accumulate and build up a peat layer, and those are areas that we call fens. The high elevation fens in the southern Rocky Mountains have their origin back 8 to 12 or even 13,000 years ago. And most of these ecosystems have been stable, the biodiversity has been preserved here, and the organic matter has been accumulating for this entire period of time. These are the oldest peatlands known in North America.
The peaty remains of these wetland plants serve many useful functions for both man and nature.
Peatlands in the Rocky Mountains are fed by groundwater, and as this groundwater moves up through this accumulation of organic matter, the organic matter removes heavy metals, uranium, excessive nutrients, and other pollutants from the water. And on a watershed scale, because most watersheds contain a number of peatlands, these peatlands perform a phenomenally important cleansing function for our water.
Unique environments spawn a host of unique plants.
So at High Creek Fen, we have a type of fen that's fed by water running off of limestone and dolomite. It has a very high pH and contains very high nutrient contents, which is why there's this fantastic floristic diversity and ecological diversity here.
Just in the nick of time and barely ahead of mining equipment that was about to continue the draining and dredging begun years before, the Nature Conservancy purchased an exceptionally fine fen in South Park called High Creek Fen.
And it happened that the landowner at the time was poised to mine the peat, and he had a valid permit to do that. And we entered into a series of negotiations with the landowner and purchased the property and all the rights to mine the peat with it. And this is a great example of why we purchased High Creek Fen. This wetland contains a dozen rare plant species and about 10 rare invertebrate species.
Conserved with this purchase are a few examples of some of the rarest plants in Colorado and on the continent.
All right, I've never seen this before. Carex hossii. I'll be darned. Carex aurea's first cousin. Well, neat. What a neat little plant. High Creek Fen is full of these neat little plants. They're all over the place out here. It's a wonderful place. This is one of the great projects the Conservancy has ever done.
These rare plants and their fen fellows, combined with their unique supply of water, form large floating mats of live plants and decaying peat that quiver and tremble when bounced upon.
This is loose. This is a quagmire.
Even though this fen was conserved for future generations, portions of it did not escape the mining required to supply organic matter to gardeners in lower elevations.
This portion of High Creek Fen was mined. The peat was scraped off and it was hauled away. In the 10 years since the fen was mined, you can see that very few plants have recolonized the gravel and the little peat that remains. The peat goes away and the plants go away. And the hummocks that are such a critical part of this wetland go away. The water table is lowered. The whole system has changed. And you can imagine how long it will take to restore the complexity in this small piece of wetland.
Vital as the purchase of High Creek Fen was, it represents a mere trace of the less than 0.3% of Colorado that is rated as wetlands. Its purchase does not conserve an ecosystem. Other high country wetlands have not been as lucky as High Creek Fen. After draining, all the vegetation, rare plants included, are pushed or dredged into large piles and left to dry. Soon, earth movers load large dump trucks that transport the peat to lower elevations, where it is used in bulk as a soil amendment, as an additive to packaged potting soils, and as a growing medium for nursery plants. At another site, Dave Cooper describes the process.
Well, this site is a total disaster. This operator came in preparation of mining this fen, dug a whole series of ditches to drain the site, dumped the dredge material in these rows right next to the ditches, and only mined a couple of small areas. The rest of this has just been drained and has sat this way for more than a decade.
What is bizarre about this whole process of destroying unique wetlands and their rare plants for the sake of gardening is that mountain peat is a low-grade, second-rate product compared to other forms of organic matter. It is not peat moss, since it contains no moss, and it may contain as little as 20% organic matter.
This is mountain peat. Once it's been excavated, piled, dried, and fractionated, ground up, this is what it is. It's mostly sediment, sands, clays, silts that have come in from the mountains. There's a little bit of organic matter in there, and you can tell it's very white, which is mostly salt, calcium carbonates, that have accumulated over the thousands of years that water has flowed through this material. This is the variability of the product. This is almost pure organic matter from the very surface of some portions of a fen, whereas much of the material is really mineral matter that's just mostly clay. Like this, there's very little organic matter in this junk. All of it has high salt content, and there's a lot of very fine mineral matter, silts and clays in here that make it a very poor soil amendment. It's amazing they even sell the garbage.
Mining mountain peatlands is a remarkably destructive process. All vegetation is killed, including rare plants, yet undiscovered insect and other animal life is destroyed, and heavy metals, including uranium, are released into drinking water supplies. Dr. Dave Cooper describes the scene of a mountain peatland mined 15 years ago along Sacramento Creek, not far from Fairplay, Colorado.
This is the Sacramento Creek fen. You can see it's got very well-developed fen vegetation here. And in front of us is what's left of it after a mining operation about 15 years ago. The entire central part of this area is still completely unvegetated.
The abuse to the land doesn't stop there. It is now known that mined wetlands cannot be restored to their former glory. The draining, dredging, and removal of peat down to bedrock forever destroys the unique sources of water necessary to keep these growing systems alive and healthy. All attempts to successfully plant anything on these mined lands has failed. These few examples of peatland destruction are not isolated cases in the Rocky Mountains. Many fens and several hundred acres have been destroyed forever for the sake of gardening and growing nursery plants.
I think it's important that even here in Denver, where we're kind of far from the peat fens that we've been discussing, that we realize the relationship between what goes on up there and the people and resources down here.
Dr. Gene Reitz of the Environmental Protection Agency gives us a larger view of the value of peatlands to water quality, wildlife habitat, and flood control for lower elevation populations.
The fens that we've been especially concerned about are in South Park, which are here in the headwaters of the South Platte. The Platte flows from South Park through some reservoirs, Cheeseman Canyon, on to the Denver metropolitan area. And again, the fact that we have these wetlands up here, they're especially important in terms of water quality protection for Denver, flood attenuation, and therefore their context in this watershed river basin is especially important for the citizens of Denver. The last thing I'd like to mention is that these values that we've talked about in terms of flood attenuation, water quality enhancement, etc., are provided at no taxpayer expense. In other words, government doesn't have to pay for these. And I think that's a very important characteristic of wetlands that is especially critical in these days of reduced budgets for all levels of government.
Flooding, loss of wildlife habitat, degraded water quality, destroyed rare plants, and unique environments do not need to be the legacy of horticulture. There is a better way, and there are far better forms of organic matter for the gardener and for nurseries growing plants in containers.
Trash. That's all it was, just trash. Now we're making a very, very good soil conditioner out of it that is beneficial in many ways to the plants.
Organic matter is where you find it, whether it be barnyard manures or leaves and other garden refuse composted in the backyard or recycled material that used to go to the landfill. Most, if not all, is better for your soil than mountain peat.
So Permagreen, as of 2 years ago actually, no longer buys, sells, packages in any way mountain peat moss. Now we're using products like this.
Permagreen, one of many companies now taking advantage of local bans on organic matter in landfills, higher landfill prices, and a general growing interest in recycling, is proud of its stand against the use of mountain peat in its products.
A few years ago, we became pretty aware that the country had to be torn up, roads had to be built. It seemed to me that wildlife was threatened, water was diverted, just to get this cheap soil conditioner that really wasn't a very good soil conditioner.
Today, just about any type of organic matter can be ground, screened, composted, and turned into a soil amendment that will increase aeration, improve drainage, lower soil pH, and add required minerals better than mountain peat.
This is what's left of shingles and cedar fence material that has been ground down to about a 3/8 minus in size. This material will be nitrified and watered, and we'll compost that. It'll turn even darker than you see here, and it becomes a finished humus, which is used as a soil conditioner.
Permagreen is proud enough of their switch from mountain peat containing products to alternative organic matter sources that they have labeled each bag the replacement for mountain peat.
Now that I see all of the problems that we went through in getting mountain peat and the operation that we have now, I would rather spend my money processing recyclable materials than going to the mountains to get peat moss.
Unfortunately, other producers of bagged and bulk organic matter and nursery plant growers do not label their product, leaving the public to discover on their own about which products do or do not contain mountain peat. Always ask if the soil amendments contain mountain peat before you make your purchase, or if nursery plants are grown in mountain peat soils. Be wary of any dark-colored material labeled mountain or Colorado peat, mountain peat moss, mountain soil, and soil mixes with a variety of names, none of which use mountain peat in their label.
They seem to be doing beautifully.
Many of our gardening challenges in the West are related to attempts to grow plants that are not especially suited to our soils. A different approach to gardening, one that centers on a plant's ability to thrive in Western soils without soil amendments, eliminates entirely the need to worry about the source of a soil amendment or the damage done to the environment to obtain it.
Here's an example of a plant that doesn't like organic matter whatsoever. This is a southwestern native, grows in the west part of Texas. It's Gara lindheimeri. It's also known as apple blossom grass because it looks a lot like apple blossoms.
Lauren Springer, author and gardening authority, proposes that we take a much closer look at native plants.
As we're looking to our native flora and to adapted plants to the more arid climates, since we're trying to conserve water, we're also finding that the plants that like less water also like less organic matter or none at all.
Native plants, especially those that used to inhabit our own garden site before your house was built, don't even like organic matter.
Well, mountain peat in any kind of organic matter will do a lot to these plants. It will create an immense flush of growth, which is very weak and floppy. It's more prone to winter kill. It does not bloom as much. It's a lot of leaf growth and not a lot of flowering. Makes them short-lived and just not stout and strong. If you get an early snow, they'll splay out in the middle. And if they're grown in a less organically rich soil, in a leaner soil, they'll be much tougher. They'll have more intense leaf coloration and a lot more flowers and a longer life.
Lauren does not advise against any use of organic matter in the garden. There are areas where it's still needed.
But ideally, you make your own compost pile, which is really not very difficult at all. I'm a very lazy composter. If I was a good composter and turned my compost pile as you're supposed to and watered it as often as I was supposed to, I would have compost every 6 weeks. It takes me about 6 months to get my compost to be good, but twice a year I got a whole lot of wonderful organic matter to put into the soil in the parts of the garden where organic matter is needed, like the vegetable garden and the areas where the more traditional trees, shrubs, and perennials are growing.
The use of mountain peat in gardening and in growing nursery plants is simply not needed. Alternative sources of organic matter not only exist, but are increasing all the time. Denver City and County Parks, the cities of Boulder and Aurora, and Denver Water are among an ever-increasing number of agencies and communities that have outlawed the use of mountain peat.
Denver Botanic Gardens does not use mountain peat. We believe people should use compost instead. It's more natural, it's better for your plants, and it's better for the environment.
When the Conservancy protected High Creek Fen, we basically protected this extremely unique wetland. And think of all the plants that are common here but very rare elsewhere that would have been lost had this been mined. Or think of the invertebrates that live here that would have been lost had this peatland been mined. All that biodiversity ends up in the gardens of people in Denver.
There is nothing noble or grand about destroying remarkable, unique ecosystems that have taken 10,000 years to create, so that gardeners can enjoy a landscape or a few plants destined to last only a few months or years.
Well, I think what's happened a lot to us gardeners is that we don't get out into the natural parts of the country or the world as much as we'd like, and I think if we did, we'd see a little bit more what's going on. If we spend so much time in our gardens, we think that's our little oasis and our place of beauty, and we don't realize that by using mountain peat, what we're doing is actually destroying a 10,000-year-old pristine natural garden, which I don't mean to put any gardeners down, including myself, but is a lot more marvelous creation than anything we can do in our lifetimes.
Let not the legacy of gardeners and gardening be one of destruction, but one of creation constructed first from respect and appreciation of what is truly beautiful.
This undisturbed peatland that we're seeing right now took 8,000 years to form. We humans can't comprehend a time scale like that. So when we folks in the Conservancy see this peatland being mined or other peatlands being mined, what we're seeing is the destruction of 8,000 years of biological history. And we can't simply wish it back to its original condition.
In the end, it comes down to a choice to find an alternative to the use of any material that produces this construction.
Colorado's wetlands support almost half of the plant species that occur in Colorado, and high elevation peatlands are also the home of fantastic biodiversity. And what's amazing is that this kind of biodiversity is dug up, ground up, dried up, and sold as peat. And this is lost forever.
And the choice is there, to preserve the natural resource found in a high country meadow and in the soil of a garden down in the city. It is the only responsible choice for any informed gardener who values the life that begins in the soil.
The peats. Peat humus is the highest, most degraded form of peat moss. Or you can't you can't even tell what the original plant materials are. pH 5 to 7.5. pH is pretty high. It's got some free nitrogen, not a whole lot of water holding capacity, and it's got a high bulk density. This is probably from the peat bogs that they were discovering the mummified remains in the British Isles. What the parent plant material was, I don't know. So, barks. Barks, we're going to split them into two categories: softwood barks and hardwood barks. Softwood barks are primarily pine, redwood, fir. The bark needs to be free of wood because we want lignified tissue, not cellulose material that's full of the xylem and such as that, because the cellulose is like sawdust and it's going to cause a lot of nitrogen deficiency. We want it free of wood. It's got the high yielding pine, southern pine bark and redwood and fir bark is going to be a pH of about 3 to 4. It's very commonly available wherever there's a forestry industry. In the southeastern United States, where there's a lot of pulp industry, a lot of pulp, southern pine bark is the potting media of choice. It can be used composted or uncomposted. If it's composted, it's going to have a considerably higher cation exchange capacity. It's going to require a little excess nitrogen, extra nitrogen, but the uncomposted, in the large nurseries, they're probably using the pine bark as fast as they can get it on their site. Typically for container production, we're screening it with a hammer mill to less than 3/8 of an inch in sieve size. If it's 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch, that's for established beds. Any bigger than that is what they use for mulch. Okay. But softwood barks work very well for growing plant material. Hardwood bark, on the other hand, is lighter in weight. It's come from versus gymnosperms, it's the dicots. It needs to be composted at least 6 months. Hardwood bark must be composted, and it has to be composted with a nitrogen source to get the composting process going. So you have to actually fertilize and spike it with a fertilizer. It's got a higher cation exchange than peat moss. Some species are actually phytotoxic. Can you guess which species of hardwood bark might be phytotoxic? Anybody had Dr. Klett's Woody Plant ID class? Can you guess which plants might be?
Cypress?
Cypress, that's not a hardwood, that's a softwood. And cypress works very well.
Oaks?
Okay, I've heard oak, I've heard willow. Oak and willow, they're okay. Cottonwoods are okay. Cottonwood's very good. Actually, anything in the Populaceae family is very good. Bingo. The Jugglandaceae family, walnuts and pecans, okay? You know, Dr. Klett probably talked about the Jugglandaceae family being allelopathic. Well, the allelopathy continues into the bark, and it's actually very plant suppressive, and it will kill your plants. So you don't want to use any barks from the Jugglandaceae family. That includes the butternuts, pecans, walnuts, and I can't remember the other. And the compound is juglone. Okay. Hardwood barks, has been a lot of work done by Ohio State University where the hardwood barks are actually disease suppressive. Disease suppressive. In other words, the composted hardwood barks prevent Pythium contamination, prevent rhizoctonia. So some people will use composted hardwood barks in lieu of using fungicides. It is disease suppressive.
Is that because of the composting process?
Is it because of the composting process or because of the wood itself? The answer is both. But it's primarily the composted hardwood bark is disease suppressive. Compared, even the composted, even better than composted softwood barks. It's disease suppressive. So pine bark should be composted. Hardwood bark must be composted. Question?
Is this somewhere we could use like beetle kill pine bark in some? Because you can't use the wood structurally because it's too damaged. So
Okay, could you use beetle kill bark for this? The answer is yes. The issue with beetle killed wood is access. Beetle killed wood is access. there are a lot of people that can get access to beetle kill wood. There's a fungus that invades the wood at a certain point that gives the wood a blue cast. And that blue cast lumber is actually a premium quality for furniture makers. And so there are a lot of people that are going out and bringing in and milling their own wood. In fact, the Sisters of Walburga, there's an abbey up at Livermore, and the Sisters of Walburga have one of the finest wood shops I have ever seen, and they're manufacturing out of beetle kill wood caskets. So if you want to buy your own beautiful beetle kill pine bark casket, go visit the Sisters of Walburga. Have you seen their shop? I mean, it's a shop that any furniture geek would ever just love to have, and it's pretty cool. And they're manufacturing caskets out of beetle kill wood. The issue is with beetle kill wood is access, because most of the beetle kill wood is in Jackson County and places like that, and they can't get heavy equipment in there to harvest the lumber because the terrain is so rugged. But in fact, you all know that the pine bark beetle is endemic and native to Colorado. The reason why people are freaking out is because the trees are dead. And you remember the beautiful, beautiful virgin forest of all these trees, right? They're gone. Will your children see those? Probably not. Maybe their grandchildren will see it again. If you were to go and walk those woods today, after like 5 or 10 years of a beetle kill forest, the understory is absolutely awesome. The aspen's coming in, other species are coming in, other species are coming in. It's the cycle of the forest. We don't live long enough in our lifespans to see the cycle of the forest, so we're sad. We've had beetle kill before. Now, the emerald ash borer is another completely different story. You all know that we have now been have confirmed cases of emerald ash borer in Boulder County. In fact, it's on the University of Boulder campus. Now, the emerald ash borer actually came into the United States out of China, where it's native, and there are other organisms to keep it in check. Yes?
I heard that it came from a shipping crate from a big box store such as Walmart or something like that. Is that possible?
It's possible. I don't know the exact facts off the top of my head, but I do know it came in on packing material. And it's moved throughout the United States on firewood. And what happens is people buy their firewood and they say, well, I've got it, and they just move to the next area. And actually, APHIS has done some research that hasn't been publicized, that they're actually tracking it to the NASCAR circuit.
My family lives in the Midwest, and because it's been so cold there for so long, there's a lot of studies coming out saying that the emerald ash borers are going to be cut way down, like with no input from human help whatsoever, because it's just been too cold for them to survive.
We're hoping you're right. We're hoping you're right. What you talk about is, okay, so do you have a question? Or you just? All right. So we're hoping, but there's plenty of emerald ash borer contamination in northern Minnesota and places like that, where it gets a whole lot colder and stays a whole lot colder than it does in Colorado. But we're hoping that it's probably been in Colorado probably 3 to 5 years, and we're just now discovering because the trees are just now declining. Why emerald ash borer has been so devastating in the United States is none of the ash species native to the United States have any resistance to the emerald ash borer. None. Whereas a lot of the trees in China do have different species such as that. So that's what happens when an invasive species comes in. There are no predators, there are no natural defenses such as that. And in the eastern United States and in the midwestern United States, the primary hardwood species is ash. In Colorado, there is no real native overstory of ash trees. Now, people say, well, what about my mountain ash? What's the genus and species of mountain ash, please? Somebody tell me. It's Sorbus. What family? Rosaceae, that's a long ways from Fagaceae, right? Not even close. That's, you know, you're comparing. So the mountain ash that's just a common name. So the arborists are even starting to get questions like, what is this emerald ash tree? No, it's not emerald ash borer. So what we're doing in Colorado is we've gone on high alert, collaboration between the Green Industries of Colorado, the Department of Ag, Colorado State University, primarily Dr. Cranshaw. He is the expert, as you're well assumed. So trying to have a no-nonsense approach to this problem. One of the first things that we tried to do is, like, within weeks, some of the fly-by-night companies are going out and trying to sell pesticide treatments on ash trees that were dormant. So, yes.
Are they doing any breeding for resistance using like
Breeding for resistance.
stocks? Or trying to like incorporate?
I'm sure somebody is, but I'm not aware of it. No. The breeding programs for woody plant species is lifetime careers. It takes forever. Yes.
Are there any restrictions on the movement of arborists with like materials after like arborist work in cities?
We're working on that.
Okay.
Right now it's all voluntary. Yes.
I don't know if you've been hearing about what they're doing in some countries, or such as Africa, where what they're doing is they're basically x-raying mosquitoes, so that way they become sterile. Normally mosquitoes only mate once inside of their lifetime. So what I was wondering is, with what's the ash beetle called once again?
Emerald ash borer.
With emerald ash borer, so what we do is basically release a whole bunch of sterilized emerald ash borers out into the open and see if that actually cuts it down.
They've probably tried that. That's probably a question for Dr. Cranshaw. I'll ask him if they're doing. I don't know if there's a program like that. When I was in McAllen, Texas, the first week of January this year, doing a research project with grapefruit, and I got an opportunity to tour the USD APHIS Mexican fruit fly rearing station, and they're doing exactly that, where the Mexican fruit fly is devastating to the citrus industry, and it's an invasive species. And McAllen, Texas, one of the primary ag base of that area is grapefruit and orange, and every day of the week, every year of the month, 365 days a year, they fly over parts of Texas, southern Texas, along the Rio Grande River, and they release sterilized fruit flies, where what they do is they rear the fruit flies, go through the whole process and get them take them to the pupal stage, and they put them in the pupa in a bag in a tube about that long and about that big around, and they pass it through an X-ray machine, a cesium generated X-ray machine. They sterilize all the fruit flies, and then they put a little dye on the pupa, so that when the adult crawls out of the pupal cocoon, it stains it between the eyes, a little red stain. So you see all these fruit flies with a little red dot on their forehead, and they're about 80% male and 20% female. And the idea is these sterile males mate with the native females, and there are no babies. And that's how they're controlling the Mexican fruit fly in the United States. So that's in fact the truth, yeah. So.
Does that only work though if they are trying to repopulate once?
Say that again, please.
Like if they only had sex once, that would only...
Well, Mexican fruit flies, they're pretty gregarious. The males will do it more than once.
Right, so then is that really that effective?
It is, because the females only take it once.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So that's the idea, is put a lot of vasectomized male fruit flies in amongst ravenous females. So Now I'm way out of line. So, but it's that is a very effective means of controlling the population, and that's what they're doing along the Rio Grande River for the citrus industry. And they have an airplane that they have these boxes. They're about this big, about this square, about that tall. They mount it in a little Cessna airplane. They fly around and they just airdrop fruit flies. So it works. So okay. Hardwood bark must be composted. Pine bark, and when we talk about plant growth regulators later in the semester, pine bark has a tendency to hold some of the plant growth regulators that we're using, like bonsai, sumagic. We'll talk about plant growth regulators later. But pine bark, we've learned that it has a little bit of an issue in that it retains some of those plant growth regulators. We have to change our application rates. Core, or coconut fiber. Some people say core, some people say coir. It's the fibrous mesocarp from the inner seed of the coconut fruit. It is a very similar in characteristics than peat moss, sphagnum peat moss. It's easier to re-wet. If you let sphagnum peat moss dry out, and if you're in a container, it shrinks away from the side of the pot, and you have to use a wetting agent to make it re-wet. Core doesn't need that. It has since it's a more raw product, you need to add a little more nitrogen to it. This is core slab.
I'm constantly hearing you say nitrogen.
Say that again, please.
I'm constantly hearing you say nitrogen. What about boron, which also affects nitrogen?
Okay, boron is rarely a problem. We're going to talk about fertilizers next, pretty soon. Nitrogen is the fertilizer element that is the highest, most greatly uptaked mineral element of all the 16 essential elements. So nitrogen is always the first one to be depleted, and nitrogen is always the first one to show a deficiency. Typically, in most cases, there's enough boron naturally occurring in the water that we don't have to worry about it. But nitrogen is the primary issue. This is a core slab. Core is it's pretty hard to see because of the darkness of the material. Core is the dust from the processing of coconuts, the mesophyll. When you buy a coconut, a full coconut at the grocery store, you're getting this brown furry seed. That's the endocarp, okay? And what's left of the fibers that you see, that's what we call core. And when they're processing and harvesting coconut, they take the longer fibers, and those are used for manufacturing of certain kinds of fabrics, real cheap fabrics that are sold in those parts of the world, for underlayment of furniture, car seats. You've probably bought core fiber foot mats and such as that. The core industry. This is a agricultural waste product. The best core products that we find for plant growth comes out of Sri Lanka. You can also get Filipino. You can get some core products anywhere you have a coconut industry, but depending on the focus of the manufacturers and the processors, depends on the quality. And like I said, we're getting some of the best quality out of Sri Lanka, but in the Filipino is pretty good. What's coming out of the Caribbean areas, typically we're seeing that to be pretty salty because they're located and processing too close to ocean sites, and they're using seawater for some of it, and it's got too much salt. I love core. You buy it in these compressed bricks, and when you You soak it, re-wet it, it expands 10 or 15 times its size. It has very good water holding capacity. It's great for hanging baskets, especially in Colorado. If I was a hanging basket grower, I would make sure that 20 to 30% of my organic matter was core, because if you put that hanging basket outside on the deck and the drawing wind across the summer comes across, it just holds on to its moisture much better. It's a really good potting material. This is in a tomato production, the slabs, such as that. It works really well. Some people do sawdust. Sawdust must be treated like hardwood bark. It must be composted. We need to get down through the first rapid rate of decomposition to get it below 30 to 1 CN ratio. And it's got a very neutral pH. The growers that are using sawdust for their potting mix usually are located close to an area where sawdust is a major waste product. For instance, furniture manufacturing, like in the southeastern United States, where you have a lot of sawdust. Manures, livestock manures must be fully composted. Must be fully composted. The quality of the livestock manures also is related to the species. Cow manure from dairies have the lowest weed risk, lowest weed species, because they feed dairy cattle better quality feed than they feed other bovine livestock. Yes?
I was hearing one of the issues that come with using certain cow manures from certain farms is sometimes the Roundup is involved inside of the plant food, which ends up killing off some of the plants that you're trying to grow.
Okay.
What's a good way to counter that?
Roundup, in fact, actually has one of the lowest half-lives of any of the herbicides we currently use. It's got to be a different, because Roundup is immediately consumed by microorganisms in soil. I mean, it's got a very, that's why it's so popular. When they're talking about Roundup contamination, it's probably not Roundup, but probably something more like Toradon or something else. So, but there could be herbicide risks with some manures, and again, you need to know where you're getting your materials. Yes.
Doesn't Roundup need organic matter to bind with in order to become non-viable?
Does Roundup need organic matter to bind? I don't know. But I do know that the microorganisms in the soil just chew up Roundup really fast.
I've heard that in desert climates, it can actually move to other plants in the vicinity of treatment because there's not enough organic matter.
Well, Roundup is a completely kills all plant material, and that's why you use it. But in the environment, it just has a very small environmental half-life.
I think what you might be thinking of, when I got my herbicide applicator's license, there are a lot of herbicides that are really good to apply right before rain, so right before a big growth spurt. So in the desert, if the plants are going to grow really fast, some herbicides don't take a good effect because they don't get into the vasculature of the plants before it gets washed off the leaves.
Mm-hmm. So.
And then also, aren't there a lot of salt problems or issues with manure?
Are there salt problems with manures? Absolutely. That's one of the issues with manures is salt contamination, specifically the ruminant manures. There's a potential for a lot of salt contamination, so it must be blended. So the best thing to do with livestock manures is to have them very, very well composted. Poultry manures are even worse because they're full of they have a lot of high level of ammoniacal nitrogen in poultry manure. Because remember, poultry only they don't have a urinary tract. All of their fecal material contains their urinary material as well. So it's very hot. So poultry manure must be composted and blended, or you're going to fry your plants. Like I said before, there's a company in Platteville, Colorado that has really gone to extreme science-based technologies to create a good composted product from poultry manure. High sulfur level, they must be pasteurized, they must be composted, And even right after pasteurization, you could have a little free ammonia release and have some ammonia toxicity. But animal manures are great materials to use. I put bagasse on here because some of you might go to the southern United States. Bagasse is actually a waste product from the sugarcane industry. I've never seen the bagasse from sugar beet industry used in potting material because most people are feeding it to their livestock. The waste sugar beets are, the cattle love it. But it's got a high sugar content. It decomposes really fast. And you'll only see it if you're working in an area like in southern Louisiana or Hawaii, someplace like that. Composted rice hulls. They're rice hulls from the rice milling industry. Especially, it's a lot of the potting soils are coming out of Arkansas. There's a couple of potting soil plants where they're shipping composted rice hulls. One of the essential elements of rice is silicon. And silicon helps support the stem to prevent lodging or falling over. And so it's got a high degree of silicon in the rice hulls. It makes it resistant to degradation and gives good structural body. It improves drainage. Across the southern United States, rice hulls is a primary component of golf greens. It's not a major issue of nitrogen depletion. Most people are using it. They're aging it as much as composting it. Rice hulls is a great product. Even starting to see some coming out of the Arkansas potting soil manufacturing plants where they're blending composted bark, chicken manure, and rice hulls. Now they're starting to manufacture pots out of rice hulls. So, calcined clay. Montmorillonite clay materials. It's got a high cation exchange capacity. It's got a high bulk density. Most of you have probably handled calcined clay if you have kitty litter in your house. That's what it is. Kitty litter and calcined clay. Kitty litter's got perfumes and some other things in there. Makes it undesirable for potting media. Could, depending on the parent material, pH 4.5 to 9. It doesn't really change the pH even though it's high. Gives good aeration, good high bulk density. Almost everybody keeps calcined clay on their property or kitty litter for oil spills, chemical spills, anything like that. If you use calcined clay or kitty litter to clean up a pesticide spill, the first thing you must know is now you've created a hazardous waste. You just can't send it to the landfill. So you got to dispose of it properly. Calcined clay is used in a lot of interior foliage plants to give a higher bulk density, especially for tall plants, so they don't tip over. Sand. A lot of people will use sand, especially if they want to increase their bulk density. It used to be a primary component of our potting soils, not so much anymore. Concrete sand. There's all different grades of sand that you're going to find in the industry. Concrete sand is the largest particle size. It's coarse. You want to make sure that you're only using washed sand, because if you just go to the sand supply place and if you just buy sand that's been quarried out of the local creek bed, it's going to have a lot of silts in it. So you want to use sand that's been washed, so you get rid of the silts, because that silt is going to clog up the pore space in your potting soil. You also want to make sure that you're not buying sand that's waste product from the Department of Transportation, because the sand that comes from the Department of Transportation is contaminated with road salt. So you want to make sure you want to stay away from that. In fact, what happens is the Department of Transportation tries to reclaim as much sand as they can after they put it down. Vail Pass, if you walk along the side of Vail Pass on the highway, they have miles and miles and miles of bunkers that capture the sand off the interstate so the sand doesn't go into Clear Creek. Because they used to let the sand just go and it would silt up and create sedimentary basins in the rivers and the creeks. On the eastern slope, it's Clear Creek. On the western slope, it's what? It's not Eagle River, is it? No, I can't remember. But anyway, they're going back and they're reharvesting that sand, and they're using it year after year after year. But sometimes they try to sell it, but you don't want to use it for potting mix because it's full of salt. Okay, vermiculite. Vermiculite is a mica-like product. If you've hiked up in the mountains and the foothills around Fort Collins, you'll see mica sticking out of the side of the mountain. It's flaky, big sheets of mineral material. Well, vermiculite is very similar to that. They take it, and they grind it up, and they heat it to 745 degrees C, and there's just enough water in there that explodes it like popcorn. And it expands out, and we get a lightweight material. It's basically chemically inert, a little bit of potassium in there, and it's fire resistant, odorless. It's used for shipping materials. It's got good water holding capacity, good aeration. Since it's a lattice material, it gives us a little bit of a cation exchange capacity, and a significant charge of potassium and a little bit of calcium and magnesium. However, over time, it does decompress. So this is what the vermiculite particles look like when they're expanded. It's a good potting media substrate, and probably most of what we see of our commercial potting mixes are a blend of sphagnum peat moss and vermiculite. Now, there's some issues with it. Most of it, this is a mined product. The biggest vermiculite mines or quarries are in South Africa, China, Brazil, Zimbabwe. What we're using in the United States mostly comes out of the southeastern United States. The vermiculite that's coming from South Africa is mostly used for insulation, used for shipping and packing material. It's not particularly a good product for potting soil because it's got a very high pH. What we're using in the United States is mostly coming out of the Appalachians. Now, you may have heard that vermiculite contains asbestos. The vermiculite mine in Libby, Montana, yes, indeed, was contaminated with asbestos. Now, it really isn't asbestos, not vermiculite itself, but there's some other ores that go along with it that are heavily contaminated with asbestos. Now, if you go and Google vermiculite Libby, Montana, you'll find gazillions of data and lots of lawsuits for mesothelioma and these sorts of things, because there was so much asbestos in that vermiculite ore that a mine worker coming home and shaking the dust out of their clothes to put in the laundry was enough to contaminate the family with asbestos. Okay, that mine is closed. So consumers are confused about this. EPA is saying that most of the likelihood of exposure to asbestos is minimal. If you're worried about it, wear a dust mask. The primary thing that we're recommending to people that handle vermiculite, if you're afraid of the asbestos dust, which it doesn't have because the only mine in the United States that has asbestos related to it is the one in Libby, Montana. All the ones out of the southeastern Appalachians are not contaminated with asbestos, is to just wet down the mix a little bit with water to knock the dust back. Perlite is another quarried material. It's a silicaceous rock material, and when it's ground up and harvested, it's heated to the point where it kind of expands like popcorn because there's a little bit of water in it, and the crude perlite rock is when it pops up, it extends about 2 to 6% of the water that's in there, makes it pop open like a piece of popcorn, makes it light, and it's heated to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. The water vaporizes, and this makes it very lightweight and also very sterile. Both vermiculite and perlite in the bag are sterile. The minute you open the bag, it's no longer sterile, but as far as needing to keep something clean or keep something sanitary for potting purposes, perlite and vermiculite It's one of the reasons why I use it for doing seeding, for propagation stuff, because it's clean and sterile. It's chemically inert. It has a pH of 7. It doesn't provide much to the plant. It's very light. It's sterile. It provides aeration, and it lightens up the potting media, so it makes it cheaper and easier and cheaper to ship. Some references you'll find refer to fluoride. In early editions in your textbook, Dr. Nelson wrote about fluoride toxicity with perlite. And what's happening is fluoride is not an essential element. It's not used by the plant in any way, but the fluoride accumulates towards the tip of a lanceolate plant, like a Dracaena or spider plants or something. You get that little tip burn at the end. A lot of times that tip burn is actually from fluoride. Older textbooks and some houseplant references, you'll see that where perlite is accused of having some fluoride toxicity. In the current edition of Nelson's book, Paul Nelson, Dr. Nelson is saying that might not be so much the case. Where's the fluoride coming from? It's probably coming from drinking water such as that. Is fluoride really a major problem? Only in lanceolate plants where the salts accumulate at the tip. So don't blame perlite necessarily for fluoride toxicity. And it's probably not even fluoride, it's probably just plain old excess salts. So here's a photograph of vermiculite on the left. You can see it's perlite is in the middle and peat moss is on the far right. A little easier to see. Vermiculite provides cation exchange capacity, a little bit of potassium, a little bit of magnesium, boost to your nutrition. And actually, a lot of times if you're using fresh vermiculite and you're comparing plant growth to vermiculite and perlite, you'll see a little jump in early plant growth because of that nutritional quality. Perlite has no nutritional quality, it's just aeration and lightens up the mix. And then of course there's, actually this isn't peat moss, I'm sorry, this is sand on the far right. Other things, other materials that you'll see used for potting soil, off and on polystyrene foam ground up, like styrofoam that you get shipping containers, has been used as the potting media substrate. It's actually quite bad. It's very lightweight. It has no water holding capacity, no cation exchange capacity. The reason why people are using it is because it's a waste product. And they're thinking, well, I can use it to lighten up my potting mix. The problem with it is that it's so light that eventually over time, even in a container, that styrofoam, the little ground up styrofoam, will work its way to the top. And then it starts blowing everywhere and getting every place. And it's really kind of hard to take care of. So it's hard to keep from blowing around. And only a couple companies are still using it. You'll see it used in the Speedling, by Speedling Corporation and other seedling companies like that. But it really is not a very good potting mix, just because it just gets everywhere. I wish there was a solution to styrofoam as a waste product. That's one of the things they were looking for, is to see if we could use ground styrofoam as a potting soil. But even if you transplant it out in the yard, it's going to float to the surface in the soil and eventually blow over to your neighbors. Another potting mix material I want to talk about is rock wool. Rock wool is a little bit on the alkaline side. It doesn't provide a lot of cation exchange capacity. It's got a pretty good water holding capacity, holds a lot of water, making it available for plants. And as a consequence, it's used quite commonly in hydroponic production. This is a picture of a hydroponic rock wool slab that used for growing tomatoes, lettuce, such as that. Rock wool has a large water reserve. It's really easy to irrigate it. One of the things about it, rock wool is so well drained, it's very not likely to hold too much water, so you'll get water logging. and you can't overwater it. So it's a pretty good material. It's spun from molten rock. It's commonly used in irrigation. It's probably one of the most common greenhouse media substitutes in Europe. However, Europe is currently dealing with waste issues with rock wool, and what they're doing with most of the waste rock wool out of the greenhouse industry is blending it with asphalt for roadsides. So, as you can see, here's a rock wool slab. You can see how white the roots are and how well aerated it is. It's a really excellent growing mix substrate for hydroponic tomatoes and hydroponic crops in general. So one of the questions people talk to me about doing potting mixes is, do we purchase potting mixes that are ready-made from a company, or do we mix our own? What's the best answer? The best answer is what's best for your company. If you're a small grower and you don't have a lot of money to invest in equipment, maybe it's best to buy something that's pre-made. You don't have to invest the capital in the equipment. If you're a large grower and you're growing through lots and lots of volume of material, it might be more efficient for you to blend your own, especially if you're doing 4 or 5 different kinds of crops that require lots of different mixes. So if you're going to formulate your own mixes, you have a significant capital investment. For smaller growers, it may take longer to depreciate and pay off your equipment. It may be easier to mix your own to save money on shipping. However, if you're mixing your own, you have to think about storage. Storaging of your potting soil, storage of your components, because it typically needs to be covered. If you're shipping into an area that's quarantined for something like Japanese beetle, your potting media storage area has to be confined with a certain size screen so that you don't get Japanese beetle. And Colorado is a state that is quarantined for Japanese beetle. And of course, if you're formulating your own mix, you need to focus on uniformity, quality. If you're buying mixes in, typically speaking, what I know a lot of growers do, that buying in a lot of large volumes of mixes, is the first thing they'll do when they get that mix in is they'll take soil samples, send it off to lab to validate, to make sure they know exactly what that mix is, because it could change from lot to lot, blend to blend, manufacturer to manufacturer, of course, or even season to season. So you need to make sure that you've got good uniformity. A small batch up to about 6 cubic feet, I mean, you can do that on a bench top. You can do that with hand, stuff like that, on a pretty easy scale. Up to about 10 cubic feet, you're starting to get into volumes that you're going to start to need some equipment. Maybe a small bucket loader with a tractor or a bobcat or something like that. I've seen growers take old cement mixers that are no longer used by cement companies and buy them on the recycle yard, set them up permanently, use that as a potting soil mixer. I mean, even for small batches for research purposes, I'll use a cement mixer I get down at the hardware store to get good uniformity. I've even seen people work a snowblower through a potting soil to get it blended up. Large scale mixing requires inline equipment, storage bins, bulk mixers, inline mix boxes to brew the chemical. You're going to have equipment to move it, and often you're going to need flat fillers and potting machines and such as that. So here's my attempt at a graphic of a mixing line where you have your Sphagnum peat moss hopper, perlite, vermiculite, one or the other or both, and we control the mixing by the belt speed. Then you have your limestone and fertilizer chemicals, and with your end results in mixings. To be better than my drawing, I have a quick video to show you from the Bolden Lawson Company out of McMinnville, Tennessee, that probably makes most of the mixing equipment that's used in the greenhouse industry in the United States.